Nestor Lakoba was the only man alive who dared to call Stalin brother. He believed that word was his shield, but he had forgotten a simple rule. The closer you stand to the tyrant, the shorter your life. He was fed a plate of poisoned trout by his oldest friends. But death was not the end of his punishment. In an act of medieval vengeance, secret police dug up his grave, dragged out his rotting corpse, and dissolved it in acid until nothing remained. This is the terrifying story of how the Lord of Abkhazia learned the 20th century's hardest lesson. In the shadow of a tyrant, being a friend is far deadlier than being an enemy. The tragedy of Nestor Lakoba played out on a specific stage, far from the gray, freezing granite of Moscow and the claustrophobic corridors of the Kremlin. It took place in a land that seemed less like a province and more like a hallucination, Abkhazia. In the early 20th century, this strip of land along the Black Sea was known as the Soviet Riviera, but even that title feels insufficient. It was a subtropical paradise of sensory overload. While the rest of Russia shivered under gray skies and queued for bread in the snow, Abkhazia was a land of eternal technicolor. The air here was heavy and sweet, perfumed with the scent of blooming mimosa, eucalyptus, and ripening tangerines. The mountains, capped with eternal snow, plunged dramatically down into the warm turquoise waters of the Black Sea. It was a land of wine, tobacco, and ancient blood feuds, a place where the harsh, mechanical rules of Bolshevism seemed to melt away under the hot Caucasian sun. And the undisputed king of this paradise was Nestor Lakoba. To the bureaucrats in Moscow, Lakoba was technically the chairman of the Central Executive Committee of Abkhazia. But to the people who lived there, and to the man himself, he was something far more ancient and far more powerful. He was a Lak, a traditional chieftain, a prince in all but name. Ruling not by the dry ink of party decrees, he governed through personality, patronage, and by a complex web of clan loyalties that predated the Russian Revolution by centuries. Lakoba was physically unimposing. He was a small, fragile-looking man, often seen wearing a simple hearing aid because he was partially deaf, a disability that oddly added to his charm. He would lean in close to hear you, creating an instant, forced intimacy. He had a soft, wrinkled face and eyes that often crinkled, with a mischievous, almost childlike humor. But this grandfatherly appearance was a mask. Behind the hearing aid and the gentle smile lay a steely, unyielding will. He was an old Bolshevik, a man who had fought in the underground, a man who knew how to use violence when necessary, but who preferred the subtler arts of negotiation and charm. In Abkhazia, Lakoba had constructed a unique political reality. Historians often refer to his domain as Lakobistan because it functioned almost as an independent state within the Soviet Union. While Ukraine and the Russian heartlands were being ravaged by the brutal famine of forced collectivization, the Holodomor, Lakoba managed to shield his people from the worst of Stalin's policies. He delayed the confiscation of land. He protected the local peasantry. He turned a blind eye to the smuggling and private trade that kept the Abkhazian economy vibrant while the rest of the country starved. He walked the streets of Sukhumi, the capital, without bodyguards. He would stop to smoke cigarettes with tobacco farmers, argue about the harvest with wine growers, and settle local disputes like a village elder. He was beloved. In the eyes of the Abkhaz people, he was not a distant communist oppressor. He was a shield. He was the man who stood between them and the terrifying machinery of Moscow. But Lakoba's power did not come from the people. He knew the grim reality of the Soviet system better than anyone. Popularity in the Soviet Union was usually a death sentence. It made you a threat. No, Nestor Lakoba's impunity, his ability to run Abkhazia as his personal fiefdom, came from one single, solitary source. It came from the fact that he was the gatekeeper to the only place where Joseph Stalin felt truly happy. Stalin, the Red Tsar, was a man exhausted by his own paranoia. By the mid-1930s, the stress of modernizing the empire and hunting for internal enemies was crushing him. He suffered from insomnia, joint pain, and nervous exhaustion. He needed an escape, and every year, like a migratory bird, he fled south. He fled to Lakoba. The relationship between Nestor Lakoba and Joseph Stalin is one of the most fascinating and disturbing psychological case studies of the 20th century. It was not merely a relationship between a subordinate and a superior. It was a primal bond forged in the shared cultural heritage of the Caucasus. They were both Georgians. They shared a language, a love for the polyphonic choral music of the mountains, and a taste for the dry, spicy wines of the region. When Stalin came to Abkhazia, he shed the skin of the dictator. He would arrive at Lakoba's private dacha, a beautiful house nestled among lemon groves and cypress trees. The transformation was immediate. The man who signed thousands of death warrants with a blue pencil would suddenly become Koba, the rough-and-tumble revolutionary of his youth. In Moscow, photographs showed Stalin surrounded by a phalanx of uniformed guards, his face a mask of impenetrable stoicism. But in Abkhazia, the lens captured a different man. In Lakoba's garden, Stalin wore white linen, sat on a wicker chair, and laughed openly. He peeled tangerines and played with children. Most crucially, he was alone with Lakoba. This is the detail that truly underscores the magnitude of Lakoba's status and his subsequent delusion. In the 1930s, access to Stalin's body was the most jealously guarded commodity in the empire. No one got close to him without being searched, vetted, and watched. Yet in Abkhazia, Nestor Lakoba walked side by side with Stalin along the pebble beaches of the Black Sea, with no security detail in sight. They would hunt together in the dense forests, two men with loaded rifles miles away from the nearest NKVD agent. This level of trust was unheard of. It defied the logic of the police state. It signaled to everyone in the Soviet hierarchy that Nestor Lakoba was untouchable. He was not just a party member, he was family. He was the Akonya, the brother. Stalin would sleep in Lakoba's guest room. He would eat food prepared by Lakoba's wife, Soria, a stunningly beautiful woman whom Stalin admired greatly. He would bounce Lakoba's son, Ralph, on his knee. For Lakoba, these summers were the foundation of his reality. He watched the most powerful man on earth relax in his home. He saw Stalin vulnerable, tired, and human. He listened to Stalin complain about the incompetence of the ministers in Moscow, about the treachery of the intellectuals, about his own health. Lakoba became the confessor, the host, the drinking companion. It is easy to see how the illusion took hold. How could the man who poured your wine, who laughed at your jokes, who slept under your roof, how could that man ever sign your death warrant? It seemed impossible. The ancient code of the Caucasus, the sacred law of adat, held that the bond between guest and host was inviolable. To harm a host, or for a host to be harmed by a guest, was a sin so profound it shattered the moral universe. Lakoba, a man of tradition, believed that even a Bolshevik revolutionary like Stalin was still bound by these ancient mountain codes. He was wrong. He forgot that Joseph Stalin had long ago traded the mountain codes for the cold, utilitarian logic of total power. This fatal arrogance manifested in Lakoba's behavior toward others. Because he felt protected by the god Stalin, he treated the demigods of the party with disdain. He was fearless, often to the point of recklessness. He refused to implement orders from Moscow if he felt they were unsuitable for Abkhazia. He openly criticized other high-ranking officials. He acted as if the rules of the Soviet game did not apply to him because he was playing a different game entirely, a game of personal friendship. Nowhere was this arrogance more visible and more dangerous than in his rivalry with Lavrentiy Beria. If Lakoba was the charismatic, traditional chieftain, Lavrentiy Beria was the modern, technocratic executioner. Beria was rising fast through the ranks of the Georgian Communist Party. He was younger than Lakoba, ambitious, sycophantic, and utterly without moral scruples. He was a predator in a suit, a man who viewed power not as a tool for leadership, but as a weapon for domination. Lakoba despised him. The animosity between the two men was visceral. It was chemical. Lakoba saw Beria as an upstart, a Menshevik traitor who had clawed his way into the Bolshevik ranks through deceit. He saw Beria as a man with no honor, a sexual predator, and a bootlicker who would say anything to please Stalin. And Lakoba made the catastrophic mistake of letting this contempt show. Because he believed he was Stalin's brother, Lakoba felt safe to humiliate Beria. There are accounts of dinner parties where Lakoba would openly mock Beria, making jokes about his appearance or his lack of revolutionary credentials. When Beria tried to assert authority over Abkhazia, Lakoba would bypass him and call Stalin directly. "I don't need to talk to the monkey," he seemed to say, "when I can talk to the organ grinder." In 1935, during a party conference, Lakoba reportedly questioned Beria's falsified history of the Bolshevik movement in the Transcaucasus, a book Beria had written to flatter Stalin. To question Beria was dangerous. To question a book that glorified Stalin was suicidal. But Lakoba did it. He did it because he thought he was special. He thought his insurance policy was valid. He did not understand that the landscape was shifting. By 1936, the sunny days of the early Soviet era were ending. The sky was darkening. Stalin was beginning to change. The relaxed guest who peeled tangerines in the garden was being replaced by the paranoid tyrant who saw treason in every shadow. Stalin began to look at the independent popular kings of the provinces not as assets, but as liabilities. Lakoba's popularity in Abkhazia, once seen as a stabilizing force, was now viewed with suspicion. Why did the people love him more than the party? Why was Lakobistan so different from the rest of the Union? Was Lakoba building a personal power base? And whispering into Stalin's ear, dripping poison day by day, was Lavrentiy Beria. Beria knew exactly how to play on Stalin's insecurities. He painted Lakoba not as a loyal friend, but as an arrogant local lord who disrespected the central authority. He suggested that Lakoba's independence was actually a form of separatism. He subtly reframed Lakoba's protection of the peasantry as sabotage against the state's economic plans. Lakoba, deaf in one ear and blinded by his own hubris, did not hear these whispers. He continued to host his dinners. He continued to rule his golden coast. He continued to treat Beria like a servant. There is a particularly haunting anecdote from late 1935 that illustrates this dynamic perfectly. During one of Stalin's visits, a shooting contest was arranged. Stalin, Lakoba, and Beria were all present. Lakoba, a skilled marksman, won the contest effortlessly. He was laughing, celebrating his victory, perhaps teasing the others. He didn't notice the cold, dead stare in Beria's eyes behind his pince-nez glasses. He didn't notice that Stalin was no longer laughing as heartily as before. The brotherhood was rotting from the inside out. The vacation was over, but Lakoba refused to pack his bags. He clung to the memory of the Koba he knew, the man who sang Georgian folk songs with him. He refused to see the monster that Koba had become. As the winter of 1936 approached, the trap was set. It was not a trap made of iron bars or barbed wire. It was a trap made of the very things Lakoba valued most: hospitality, friendship, and food. The Lord of the Golden Coast was about to be invited to a dinner from which he would never return. He was about to learn that in the Soviet Union, the only thing more dangerous than a hungry wolf is a smiling one. On the balcony of his villa in Sukhumi, looking out over the Black Sea sunset, the air smelled of salt and jasmine. The air was heavy with salt and jasmine. Lakoba lit a cigarette, adjusted his hearing aid, and smiled. He was the king of Abkhazia, the friend of Stalin, and he believed he was the safest man in the world. He did not know that his grave had already been dug, or that the man holding the shovel was about to call him to dinner. A heavy silence fell over the Caucasus in the freezing weeks of late 1936. The eventual murder was not a sudden impulse. It was the calculated climax of a long-festering geopolitical abscess. By November of that year, the animosity between Lakoba, the lord of Abkhazia, and Lavrentiy Beria, the rising predator of the Georgian Communist Party, had transcended mere bureaucratic rivalry to become a spectacle of public hatred. It culminated in a terrifying scene inside the smoky, high-ceilinged offices of the party Central Committee in Moscow, a confrontation that witnesses would later whisper about with a mixture of awe and horror. In a room filled with the most dangerous men in the Soviet Empire, Nestor Lakoba did the unthinkable. He lost his temper at the wrong man. He reportedly screamed at Beria, calling him a non-entity, a crook, and a traitor to the revolutionary blood that had been spilled in the valleys of the Caucasus. In the terrified etiquette of the Stalinist elite, such an outburst was tantamount to suicide. Yet Lakoba, drunk on his own legend and his fatal faith in Stalin's protection, believed he was the one man who could spit in the face of the devil and live to tell the tale. He returned to the warmth of Abkhazia feeling victorious, convinced that his seniority and his personal bond with Koba had cowed the younger, bespectacled upstart. But while Lakoba was shouting, Beria was calculating. Lavrentiy Beria was a man who understood the mechanics of the meat grinder better than anyone else in the Soviet Union. He knew that in a totalitarian system, the man who loses his temper exposes his throat, while the man who smiles and waits is the one who eventually holds the knife. Beria faced a tactical dilemma. He could not simply arrest Lakoba, for the lord of Abkhazia was too beloved by his people, and a public purge might spark a rebellion in the volatile borderlands or provoke questions from Stalin himself. Beria needed a solution that was cleaner, quieter, and wrapped in the plausible deniability of natural causes. He needed to lure the old lion out of his fortified den and into a space where the rules of engagement were controlled entirely by the host. The weapon Beria chose to break the stalemate was not a pistol or a warrant, but a weapon forged from the ancient, sacred traditions of the Caucasus, the weapon of hospitality. In the final days of December 1936, a telephone rang in Lakoba's residence in Sukhumi, shattering the peace of the subtropical winter. The voice on the other end likely belonged to a woman, perhaps Beria's mother, Marta, or his wife, Nina. The invitation was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. It was framed simply as a warm, familial reconciliation dinner. It was an olive branch extended by a family matriarch, inviting the two feuding Georgian comrades to bury the hatchet, drink wine, toast to the incoming new year, and put their petty squabbles behind them for the greater good of the party. This was the genius of the trap. Beria knew that Lakoba, for all his Bolshevik rhetoric, was at his core a traditional Caucasian chieftain, bound by the unwritten laws of Adat. In their culture, to refuse a dinner invitation from an elder woman was a grave insult, a breach of honor so profound it would brand the refuser as a coward and a boor. Beria effectively weaponized Lakoba's own sense of honor against him, forcing him into a corner where accepting the invitation was the only socially acceptable option. And so, on December 26th, Nestor Lakoba made the fatal decision to leave the safety of his Golden Coast. There is a heavy cinematic foreboding that hangs over this journey as we look back through the lens of history. He left behind the scent of blooming mimosas and the rhythmic crashing of the Black Sea waves to travel inland toward the Georgian capital. As his car wound through the mountain passes, moving from the lush coast into the starker, colder interior, he was physically crossing the line from his own sovereign territory into the undisputed domain of his enemy. His entourage, comprising his most loyal aides and perhaps even his intuitive wife Saria, were deeply anxious, sensing the danger that Lakoba refused to acknowledge. They warned him that Beria was a snake whose bite was lethal, but Lakoba, shielded by his hubris, waved away their concerns with the dismissive confidence of a man who believes he carries a talisman of invincibility. He wouldn't dare, Lakoba reasoned, not with me, and certainly not while Stalin is watching. Lakoba arrived in Tbilisi, a city of fog, damp cobblestones, and fading imperial elegance, a place where the shadows seemed to hold more secrets than the light. He checked into the Hotel Orient, the grandest establishment in the city, unaware that this hotel room would soon become the stage for his final agonizing hours. On the evening of December 27th, the atmosphere in the city would have been festive, with the streets preparing for the new year. But for Lakoba, the clock was ticking down to zero. He dressed for dinner, perhaps looking in the mirror and seeing a powerful statesman about to graciously accept the surrender of a rival, rather than a victim preparing for the altar. When the car arrived to take him to Beria's residence, Lakoba made the final irreversible error. He stepped into the vehicle alone. To bring armed bodyguards to a private family dinner would have been a breach of etiquette, an insult to the host's hospitality, and so stripping himself of his physical defenses to maintain his social grace, he traveled defenseless into the heart of the darkness. The car pulled up to number 11 Machabeli Street, a handsome, imposing building that had once belonged to a wealthy merchant before being repurposed for the Soviet elite. From the exterior, the house looked warm and inviting, with golden light spilling from the windows onto the winter street, suggesting a sanctuary of comfort, food, and laughter. But as Lakoba stepped onto the pavement, he was crossing the threshold into a slaughterhouse disguised as a home. The door opened, and there stood Lavrentiy Beria, soft-looking, balding, with round pince-nez glasses reflecting the hallway light. He looked more like a mild-mannered accountant than a monster, greeting his enemy with a wide, open embrace. This was the Judas kiss, performed with the consummate skill of a psychopath. "Nestor, my dear friend." Come in, come in. It is so cold outside," Beria would have exclaimed, his voice dripping with synthetic warmth, dissolving the tension of their recent conflicts in a bath of performative Georgian brotherhood. Lakoba stepped across the threshold, and the heavy door clicked shut behind him, sealing out the noise of the city, sealing out the cold wind, and sealing out any hope of rescue. Inside, the house was a sensory overload designed to disarm. It smelled of walnuts, saffron, cilantro, and roasting meat, the signature aromas of a Georgian feast that signaled safety, home, and tradition. Lakoba could not smell the metallic taint of the laboratory, nor could he see the invisible noose tightening around his neck. He saw only a table laden with his favorite dishes, the crystal sparkling under the chandelier, and perhaps Beria's deaf mother, Marta, nodding a greeting, innocent of the macabre part she was playing in her son's deadly theater. Whatever apprehension Lakoba had carried from Sukhumi evaporated in this domestic warmth. He allowed himself to believe the lie. He sat down at the table surrounded by thick walls and draped windows, utterly isolated, with no witnesses but the people Beria owned. The conversation that followed was likely light and jovial, a grotesque pantomime of friendship, where they discussed the harvest, the party plenums, and mutual acquaintances, talking about everything except the singular, terrifying truth that one of them was a hunter and the other was prey. Beria, playing the role of the gracious host to perfection, poured the wine, a dark, rich Georgian vintage, and pushed the glass across the white tablecloth toward Lakoba. "To our friendship, Nestor," Beria might have said, a thin smile playing on his lips, "and to the future." Lakoba lifted the glass, looking into the eyes of the man he had underestimated for years, and smiled back. He drank. He did not know that he was drinking his own funeral rites. He did not know that the biological time bomb had been set and that he had less than 12 hours of agony left to endure. The trap had snapped shut with a deafening silence. The Lord of Abkhazia was no longer a ruler, but a walking corpse waiting for his body to catch up with his fate. The menu for the evening had been selected with a predator's insight into the prey's desires. Beria knew that Lakoba was a man of simple but specific tastes. He knew that Lakoba had a particular weakness for fried trout, a dish that reminded him of his childhood in the pristine rivers of Abkhazia. And so, the centerpiece of the meal was a platter of perfectly prepared fish, their skin crisp and golden, their flesh tender and steaming. Historical accounts and whispered oral traditions from the survivors of that era suggest a detail that adds a layer of Shakespearean perversion to the crime. The fish was reportedly prepared by Beria's own mother, Marta. She was a pious, deaf woman who likely had no idea that her culinary skills were being weaponized by her son. Beria used the sanctity of his own mother's hands to deliver the poison, knowing that Lakoba would never suspect a dish cooked by an old woman to be the instrument of his destruction. Inside the dining room, time seemed to slow. Beria, ever the solicitous host, likely served the fish himself, his pale, soft hands lifting the trout onto Lakoba's porcelain plate. "For you, Nestor," he might have said, his voice smooth and devoid of any tremor. "Mother made it especially for you." This was the moment of the transfer. Whether the poison, likely a sophisticated compound of cyanide or a mercury-based toxin developed in Grigory Marinovsky's notorious Lab X, was injected into the fish beforehand, or whether it was dusted over the skin like a seasoning, is a detail lost to the fires of the NKVD archives. But the effect was the same. The weapon was now on the plate. The substance hidden in the flesh of the trout was likely not a common arsenic found in a pharmacy. It was almost certainly a product of Lab X, the top-secret toxicology laboratory run by the sinister Grigory Marinovsky, known as Stalin's Dr. Death. In a soundproof facility in Moscow, Marinovsky tested tasteless, odorless toxins on political prisoners to create the perfect biological weapon, one that mimicked natural causes and left no trace for an autopsy. Beria wasn't just serving dinner, he was conducting a field test of the NKVD's latest lethal technology. Lakoba picked up his fork. He was relaxed. He was likely hungry after the journey from the hotel. He cut into the fish. He lifted the first bite to his lips. In that split second, the fate of Abkhazia, The lives of his family and his own future were sealed. He chewed and swallowed. The toxin entered his system, sliding down his esophagus and settling into his stomach, where the acid began the chemical process of releasing the lethal agents into his bloodstream. To ensure the poison's efficacy, Beria poured the drinks. In the toxicology of the 1930s, it was well understood that alcohol acts as a vasodilator. It widens the blood vessels and accelerates the absorption of toxins. Beria urged Lakoba to drink cognac, a strong amber liquid that would mask any slight bitterness the poison might have left on the tongue. They toasted. They clinked glasses. To friendship, they said. To Stalin. With every sip of the burning cognac, Lakoba was unknowingly revving the engine of his own death, speeding up the distribution of the poison to his vital organs. The dinner concluded without Lakoba dropping dead on the spot. This was by design. The poisons developed by the NKVD were often engineered to have a delayed onset, creating a window of time that would allow the assassin to establish an alibi. Beria needed Lakoba to be seen alive, well, and smiling in public after leaving his house. He needed hundreds of witnesses to testify that Nestor Lakoba was in high spirits when he walked out the door. And so, Beria insisted on the second act of his macabre play, a trip to the opera. The Tbilisi Opera House is a building of magnificent Moorish Revival architecture, a temple of high culture. On that night, it was packed with the cream of Georgian society. Beria and Lakoba arrived together, taking their seats in the government box. The curtain rose. The music swelled. Perhaps it was the heavy, tragic notes of Mussorgsky or the soaring melodies of a ballet. But as the orchestra played, a different, far more terrible drama began to unfold inside Nestor Lakoba's body. The first sign was likely a subtle discomfort, a heaviness in the pit of the stomach that Lakoba might have initially dismissed as indigestion from a rich meal. But within minutes, the discomfort mutated into something sharp and vicious. The poison was beginning to strip the lining of his stomach. A cold sweat would have broken out on his forehead, glistening under the electric lights of the opera box. His hands, resting on the velvet railing, would have started to tremble, not from cold, but from the firing of nerve endings under assault. Beside him, Lavrentiy Beria watched with the supreme self-control of an assassin. He sat there, adjusting his pince-nez, feigning enjoyment of the performance, while out of the corner of his eye, he monitored the biological collapse of his enemy. When Lakoba leaned over, perhaps clutching his abdomen, and whispered that he was feeling unwell, Beria played the concerned friend to perfection. He expressed shock. He offered water, but he did not suggest a doctor immediately. He let the poison work for a few minutes longer, ensuring that the dose was fully absorbed. The pain eventually became unmanageable. Lakoba could no longer maintain the facade of the dignified statesman. The nausea rose in his throat like a tide of acid. He excused himself, stumbling out of the box, leaving the music and the applause behind. He was rushed to his car and driven back to the Hotel Orient. The journey back to the hotel must have been a blur of agony, the cobblestones of Tbilisi sending jolts of pain through his convulsing body, the city lights streaking past the window like a fever dream. When he reached his suite at the Hotel Orient, the slow burn of the poison accelerated into a full-blown medical catastrophe. This is where the story shifts into the realm of body horror. The specific toxin used against Lakoba attacked the central nervous system and the respiratory tract simultaneously. As he lay on the bed, still dressed in his formal suit, his body began to wage a hopeless war against the invader. The symptoms were graphic and terrifying. He began to vomit violently, his body trying to expel the poisoned fish, but it was too late. The vomit was likely tinged with blood, a sign that his internal tissues were hemorrhaging. His throat would have felt like it was on fire, a sensation described by victims of similar poisonings as swallowing razor blades or molten lead. This was corrosive gastritis, a chemical burning of the digestive tract. But the physical pain, as horrific as it was compounded by a terrifying sensation of suffocation. The poison was interfering with the ability of his red blood cells to carry oxygen. Lakoba was gasping for air, his chest heaving, his lungs working furiously, yet he felt as though he were drowning. This is the hallmark of cyanide-based compounds, internal asphyxiation. The air is in the room, the lungs are pumping, but the cells are starving. He was drowning on dry land, in a luxury hotel room, while his skin turned a clammy pale gray. His entourage, his driver, his bodyguard, and perhaps a local doctor summoned in haste, stood around the bed, paralyzed by helplessness. The doctor, if he was not already compromised by Beria, would have been baffled. A heart attack, food poisoning? The symptoms were too violent, too rapid, and even if they suspected poison, there was no antidote in a hotel room in 1936. They could only watch as the Lord of Abkhazia was reduced to a writhing, gasping wreck. It was in the midst of this physical torture that the psychological climax occurred. This is the moment of anagnorisis, the sudden, horrifying realization of the truth. Between the bouts of retching and the convulsions that arched his back off the mattress, Lakoba's mind cleared for a fleeting second. The fog of pain lifted just enough for him to connect the dots. The dinner, the fish, the cognac, the smile on Beria's face, the invitation from the mother. It all clicked into place with the devastating force of a sledgehammer. He realized, with a despair that is impossible to articulate, that his brotherhood with Stalin had been a mirage. He realized that his arrogance had blinded him. He realized he had walked into the trap smiling. Summoning his last reserves of strength, Lakoba grabbed the arm of his loyal bodyguard, or perhaps his driver. He pulled him close, his breath smelling of bile and decay. He spoke in Abkhaz, his native tongue, a language Beria could not understand, a language of the mountains that was now the only safe place left. "The snake," he gasped out. "The snake Beria has killed me." It was not a question. It was a verdict. In his final moments, Lakoba did not call out for a priest or for Stalin. He used his last breath to name his murderer. He wanted the truth to be known, even if only to the one man standing beside his deathbed. He wanted to strip away the lie of the heart attack before it could even be written. The end came in the early hours of December 28th, 1936. The convulsions slowed not because the pain had ceased, but because the body had no more energy to fight. His organs, liver, kidneys, heart, were shutting down one by one like lights being turned off in a grand house. The erratic, thundering rhythm of his heart fluttered and then stopped. The gasping breath rattled in his throat, the death rattle, and then silence filled the room. Nestor Lakoba, the man who had ruled the Soviet Riviera, the man who had hunted with Stalin, lay dead at the age of 43. His face was twisted in a rictus of agony, a frozen scream that bore witness to the violence of his departure. The doctors, trembling under the pressure of the moment, pulled the sheet over his head. But the horror was not over. In the hallway, or perhaps arriving moments later, were Beria's men. They were not there to mourn. They were there to manage the narrative. The first thing they did was secure the body. An immediate autopsy was ordered, not to find the truth, but to bury it. The medical examiners, working under the heavy, threatening shadow of the NKVD, removed Lakoba's intestines and stomach contents. This was standard procedure in poisoning cases disguised as natural deaths. By removing the organs that contained the highest concentration of the toxin, they destroyed the evidence. The official report was typed up before the body was even cold: angina pectoris, a heart attack. The irony was absolute. They claimed his heart had failed him. In a metaphorical sense, it had. His heart had trusted the wrong friend. As the sun rose over Tbilisi on that cold December morning, the news began to spread. The king was dead. But inside the Hotel Orient, the smell of vomit and fear still lingered in the air. The physical destruction of Nestor Lakoba was complete. He had been chemically dismantled from the inside out. Yet for the Stalinist machine, the death of the biological man was insufficient. The body was dead, but the symbol remained. And to the totalitarian mind, a dead hero is just as dangerous as a living rival. The execution of the man was finished. The execution of the corpse was about to begin. If the murder of Nestor Lakoba was a crime of the flesh, what followed was a crime of the soul. This final act was so grotesque that it seems to belong less to the 20th century and more to the darkest myths of antiquity. In the Stalinist universe, death was not the end of a man's suffering. It was merely a change in his administrative status. For the totalitarian state, a dead man is still a political actor. He can be a martyr, a symbol, or a weapon. And if he cannot be controlled in the grave, then the grave itself must be destroyed. The assassination of Nestor Lakoba was only the prologue. The true horror lay in the execution of the corpse. The immediate aftermath of Lakoba's death in the Hotel Orient was characterized by a grand cynical masquerade. The Soviet propaganda machine, greased by the very men who had poisoned him, roared into life to manufacture a lie of epic proportions. On the morning of December 28th, the newspapers of the Soviet Union were bordered in black. Instead of announcing the assassination of a rival, they proclaimed the tragic premature passing of a loyal Bolshevik, a passionate fighter for the revolution, and a brother. The medical report, falsified by doctors trembling under the gaze of the NKVD, cited a heart attack, natural causes brought on by the tireless work of building socialism. This was the first layer of the betrayal, to deny Lakoba even the dignity of being a victim, to rob him of the truth of his own murder. His body was transported back from Tbilisi to Sukhumi by a special train. As the locomotive wound its way through the mountains and down to the Black Sea coast, crowds of weeping Abkhazians lined the tracks. To them, the grief was real. They had lost their protector, their Lak. They threw flowers onto the tracks, unaware that they were mourning a man killed by the very government they lived under. When the body arrived in Sukhumi, the theater of hypocrisy reached its zenith. A state funeral was organized with all the pomp and circumstance of a royal burial. The streets were draped in red and black banners. Military bands played the slow, heavy marches of Chopin and Beethoven. And there, walking at the front of the procession, his face a mask of somber bereavement, was Lavrentiy Beria. The psychological monstrosity of this image was absolute. The man who had poured the poison, the man who had watched Lakoba writhe in agony just hours before, was now acting as the chief mourner. Beria helped carry the coffin. He delivered a eulogy, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion, praising the man he had hated for a decade. Moscow sent a massive wreath, larger than any other, with a ribbon that read, "To an old comrade and friend from J. Stalin." It was the ultimate gaslighting. The murderer was serving as the pallbearer. The tyrant was sending flowers to the man he had ordered killed. For the people of Abkhazia, this visual confirmation of Stalin's love for Lakoba would make the subsequent betrayal even more shattering. Lakoba was laid to rest in the most honorable spot in Abkhazia. The Sukhumi Botanical Gardens. It was a place of peace, surrounded by the exotic palms and flowers he had loved, a fitting shrine for the Lord of the Golden Coast. A mausoleum was planned. Schools and streets were hastily renamed in his honor. For a few brief weeks in early 1937, Nestor Lakoba was a saint of the Soviet pantheon. He was safe in the earth, his legacy secured in marble and bronze, or so it seemed. But the winds of 1937 were unpredictable and violent. The Great Terror was beginning to spin its centrifuge of blood, and the logic of the purge demanded new enemies. A dead hero is dangerous to a living dictator because a hero can become a rallying point for dissent. A shrine can become a place of pilgrimage. Stalin and Beria realized that by canonizing Lakoba, they had inadvertently strengthened Abkhazian nationalism. They needed to break the spirit of the region, and to do that, they had to destroy its idol. The turn came with terrifying speed. It started with whispers, then editorials, and finally, screaming headlines. The narrative flipped 180 degrees. The hero was suddenly branded a traitor. The loyal Bolshevik was posthumously accused of being a bourgeois nationalist, a spy for foreign powers, and, in a projection of supreme irony, a plotter who had intended to assassinate Stalin. The man they had murdered was now accused of trying to murder them. It was decided that a traitor did not deserve to rest in the botanical gardens. He did not deserve a grave at all. What happened next is a scene of Gothic horror that serves as the defining image of the Stalinist approach to memory. Sometime in 1937, under the cover of darkness, a squad of NKVD agents entered the Sukhumi Botanical Gardens. The park was silent, the air heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, the same sweet air Lakoba had breathed in life. But the agents were not there to pay respects. They carried shovels, pickaxes, and chemical supplies. They began to dig. This was not a bureaucratic act, it was manual labor. The sound of metal striking the earth, the grunt of men working in the dark, the lantern light flickering on the leaves. They dug down to the coffin of the man they had buried with honors only months before. They pried the lid open. Inside lay the decomposing body of Nestor Lakoba. One might think that death would grant immunity from prosecution, that a rotting corpse is no longer a subject of the state. But in the eyes of Beria, the body was still an enemy. It was a physical object that occupied space in Soviet soil, and that space had to be reclaimed. The agents dragged the corpse out of the coffin. There are conflicting historical accounts about the specific method of destruction, but all agree on the intent: total annihilation. Some sources say the body was taken to a remote lime pit in the wild districts outside the city. Quicklime is a caustic substance that reacts violently with water and organic matter, generating intense heat and chemical burns that dissolve flesh and bone into a nondescript slurry. Other accounts suggest an even more industrial end, that the body was incinerated in a furnace or dissolved in acid. The objective was necrolatry in reverse. If necrolatry is the worship of the dead, this was the active persecution of the dead. They wanted to ensure that there was no bone, no tooth, no scrap of clothing left for his family to weep over. They wanted to turn Nestor Lakoba into a non-person. He was not just killed, he was unbirthed. His existence was scrubbed from the physical world. The grave in the botanical garden was filled back in, the ground leveled, the grass replanted. To the passerby the next morning, it was as if he had never been there. The Lord of Abkhazia had become a phantom. With the body annihilated, Beria launched a campaign of cultural devastation against the land itself. A process of forced assimilation known as mingrelization began. The Abkhaz language was banned in schools, place names were changed, and massive population transfers were orchestrated to make the Abkhaz people a minority in their own home. The Soviet Riviera was turned into a standard totalitarian province, suffocated under Beria's boot. The destruction of Lakoba's corpse was merely the prologue to the intended destruction of his people. But the vengeance of the state is rarely satisfied with the dead. The dead cannot feel pain. They cannot scream. To truly punish Lakoba, Beria had to hurt the parts of him that were still alive. He turned his gaze toward the survivors. Saria was Nestor's wife, a woman of legendary beauty, grace, and intelligence. She was a quintessential Caucasian woman, proud, fiercely loyal, and deeply embedded in the culture of honor. During the golden years, she had been the hostess to Stalin, the woman who prepared his meals and managed the household where the dictator slept. Stalin had admired her. There are even rumors that he had courted her in his clumsy, menacing way. But now, she was the widow of an enemy of the people. Beria had a specific use for Saria. He did not want to simply shoot her. That would be a waste. He needed her to legitimize the lie. He needed the widow to sign a confession stating that her husband had indeed been a traitor, that he had plotted against Stalin, and that she had helped him. A confession from Saria would be the final nail in Lakoba's coffin, the ultimate propaganda coup that would demoralize the entire Abkhazian population. Saria was arrested and taken to the NKVD prisons in Tbilisi. Thus began a contest of wills between a grieving widow and the entire apparatus of the Soviet secret police. The torture of Saria Lakoba is documented in the dark annals of history as one of the most brutal episodes of the Great Terror. She was placed in a cell and subjected to conveyor interrogations that lasted for days and nights without break, designed to shatter the mind through sleep deprivation. When that failed, they turned to physical violence. She was beaten severely. Her beautiful features, once admired by the Politburo, were reduced to a swollen mask of bruises. But Saria would not break. She understood exactly what Beria wanted. He wanted to destroy Nestor's name, and she was the only guardian left of that name. To sign the paper would be to kill her husband a second time. She refused. Beria, infuriated by her resistance, escalated the cruelty. He attacked her motherhood. Her young son Ralph, a teenager who had once sat on Stalin's knee, was arrested. He was brought to the prison. In a scene of unspeakable sadism, Beria's men tortured the son in front of the mother, or threatened to do so, promising mercy only if she signed. Imagine the agony of that choice. The physical pain of her own body was nothing compared to the torment of seeing her child threatened. Yet Saria held the line. She possessed a core of steel that Beria, a man without a soul, could not comprehend. She reportedly looked her tormentors in the eye and said, "I will not defame the memory of my husband." She knew that signing would not save Ralph. It would only damn Nestor. She chose honor over hope because in 1937 hope was already dead. Her resistance doomed her son as well. Ralph was just a teenager who had grown up calling Stalin uncle. In his naivety, while in prison, he reportedly wrote a desperate letter to the Kremlin, believing that Uncle Koba simply didn't know what the wicked Beria was doing to his family. The letter never saved him. It merely ended up in a dossier. Stalin knew, and Stalin approved. Ralph was executed in a Moscow prison in July 1941, shot in the back of the head, a final ruthless erasure of the boy who had once played in the gardens of Sukhumi. One particularly chilling anecdote, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps real, captures the surreal horror of her imprisonment. It is said that Beria, frustrated by her silence, ordered a live snake to be placed in her cell. He knew she had a phobia of snakes. He wanted to drive her insane with fear. Whether this specific detail is true or a legend born of the collective trauma of the time, it illustrates the personal, vindictive nature of Beria's hatred. He wasn't just an executioner. He was a tormentor who derived pleasure from the psychological disintegration of his victims. Saria Lakoba never signed. She defeated Lavrentiy Beria. But the victory cost her everything. After months of torture, her body finally gave out. She died in the prison hospital, alone, broken, but unbowed. She died preserving the truth. Her son Ralph did not survive either. He was kept in the camps for a few years, a child of the Gulag, before being shot in 1941. The entire Lakoba bloodline was systematically extinguished. The brothers, the cousins, the in-laws, the purge of Abkhazia was total. It was a genetic erasure. Beyond the torture cells and the lime pits, the legacy of Nestor Lakoba remains a stark lesson in the wider landscape of history. For decades, his name was forbidden in the Soviet Union. He was an unperson. His face was airbrushed out of photographs. The history books were rewritten to remove his tenure as the leader of Abkhazia. If you visited Sukhumi in the 1940s or 50s, there was no monument, no plaque, no whisper of the man who had built the republic. The silence was absolute. It was only after the death of Stalin in 1953 and the subsequent execution of Beria that the truth began to seep back out of the cracks in the earth. During the thaw, Lakoba was rehabilitated. His reputation was restored. A monument was finally built in the botanical gardens, near the empty space where his bones had once rested. But a monument is cold comfort for a life so brutally dismantled. The story of Nestor Lakoba is not just a biography of a Bolshevik warlord. It is a cautionary tale that resonates across the centuries. It serves as a grim warning about the nature of power and the illusion of intimacy with tyrants. Lakoba's fatal flaw was not that he was a bad politician, but that he was a sentimental man in an unsentimental age. He believed that the bonds of friendship, the sharing of bread and salt, and the memories of youth were stronger than the cold calculus of the state. He believed that calling a monster brother would keep the monster from eating him. He was wrong. In the end, Nestor Lakoba teaches us that in the orbit of a dictator, there are no friends, only temporary survivors. The hand that shakes yours today is the hand that will sign your death warrant tomorrow. The lips that smile at you across the dinner table are the lips that will order your body to be dissolved in acid. The ghost of Nestor Lakoba leaves us with the enduring image of that dinner in Tbilisi, the warm light, the clinking glasses, and the laughter. It is a terrifying reminder that the face of evil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like an old friend, pouring a glass of wine and waiting for you to take the first sip. This is the lesson of the poisoned feast and the epitaph of the man who dared to call Stalin brother